In this week's lecture notes, we'll be talking about a couple of things. We'll be talking about loyalty between employer and employee and vice versa. We'll talk about conflict of interest, and we'll give a little bit of background and discuss this notion of whistleblowing. So in the week 5 lecture notes, let's take a look at number 1 here. So what are some duties that you would expect an employer to have to the employee? In other words, what should a company provide to the employee? Now, we could make a long list of different things, but one thing that I can think of is salary. So I expect the company that I work for to give me a salary. Another thing I would expect from the company is benefits, like, for example, paid sick leave, and so on and so forth. What about the other way around? What should me, as an employer, what should I do on behalf of my company that I work for? Well, I should provide honest day's work. I should be on time to meetings. Right? So these are, just some examples. But if you make a list of expectations or duties with respect to employer to the employee or employee to the employer, we can say that a lot of it boils down to this notion of loyalty, right? So we can think in terms of values. We can think that an employer has a duty to be loyal to the employee, right? So for example, even if the company is not doing well, the company should still be expected to provide a salary and benefits. That's a form of loyalty. At the same time, we can expect an employee to have loyalty to the employer. So as an employee, you should provide honest work even if you're not being watched, and you should be on time to work even if you're not being monitored, because this is another example of loyalty. So with that in mind, let's go over a couple of other concepts here. And here I've already written down conflict of interest. Conflict of interest can be defined as inappropriately prioritizing a secondary interest. So as a CPA, your primary interest is a duty to the public. And your secondary interest can be making money, family, etc. So it's very interesting that as an ethicist, I often hear people tell me that if you're going to be ethical, it means that you're going to be poor. Okay, so I think that that's very far from the truth, because people think, well, if you're ethical, it means that you don't make as much money. Well, that's not true, because if you're acting ethically, if you're acting so that you reduce conflict of interest, it means that you have a primary interest. In this case, as a CPA, it's your duty to the public. And after that, number 2, you can focus on making money, being successful. You can focus on your family and everything else. So basically, you can do all of those things. It just means that if you're going to reduce conflict of interest, you have to prioritize everything properly. Conflict of interest arises when we put a secondary interest ahead of a primary interest. So if you put making money ahead of your duty to the public, and you put money first, and you sacrifice your duty to the public, you sacrifice your fiduciary duty, is what it's called, then you engage in a conflict of interest. Now, when we think of conflict of interest can be defined in terms of 4 different domains. So potential conflict of interest is what we'll start out with first. Potential conflict of interest is more situational. And oftentimes we say potential conflict of interest is something that looks bad and could become bad in actuality. So for example, if you put yourself in a situation where you start to socialize with your audit client, Okay, so let's say that I'm auditing a company, and it's okay to go out to lunch with them or go to some type of event one time. But if you start to get really cozy with your audit client, you start having them over to your house and then you start drinking beer together, then that becomes a potential conflict of interest. Now, nothing is wrong yet, but this is starting to become a situation that looks bad, and it could become bad in actuality. Now, what if I am auditing a company and I start to take bribes from the company that I'm auditing? So I say, okay, if you give me $1 million, I will give you a certain audit report that you like, or I'll give you a certain outcome that you want if you start to give me money. Then this becomes an actual conflict of interest. So this is something that in substance is improper. And again, a violation of conflict of interest, in other words, having a conflict of interest is another way to say it, is when you put a secondary interest inappropriately ahead of a primary interest. So first you put yourself in a situation that could be bad, and then if that situation does become bad, it becomes an actual conflict of interest. Now, it's important to note that when it comes to conflict of interest, a lot of people think about conflict of interest in terms of individuals. So certainly, if you're the CEO of a company, you can start to commit fraud and steal money or embezzle. That's going to be a conflict of interest. You're acting in a conflict of interest because you're violating your duties as a manager. So conflict of interest can involve people or individuals, but additionally, they can also involve organizations. So organizations can act and have a conflict of interest. We know that organizations can be sued, just like individuals. We know that organizations can be held negligent, just like individuals. So organizations can be thought of very much like people, and that means that organizations can also engage in a conflict of interest. So when we think of conflict of interest, we think of conflict of interest in terms of whether it's actual or potential, so the substance or the appearance, and also we can think of conflict of interest in terms of who the actors are. So the actors can be individuals or organizations. We can say that potential conflict of interest comes first, and then that can become actual conflict of interest. Conflict of interest can involve individuals, so we can say actors like A, or it can be organizations, so it can be actors that we can call letter B. Now, what happens if somebody commits fraud? That could be an example of conflict of interest, certainly. So if I am an employee, then I have a duty to act faithfully on behalf of my employer. And if I commit fraud and start embezzling, then not only is that against the law, not only is that fraud, but that also can be seen or deemed to be a conflict of interest. If you have a company and the company is not providing a service faithfully to its customer, or it's not treating its employees properly, it could also be engaging in a conflict of interest. So what I want to point out here is this notion of fraud. So I think many of you have seen this before. This is Exhibit A in the lecture notes. In a previous class, we talked about the elements of fraud. Remember, you can have negligence, which is bad, gross negligence, which is worse, and then fraud is the worst. So if you take the example of an individual, like an employee working in an organization, what puts that person in a situation where they actually commit fraud? Well, there's three different dimensions, or three different things. The first thing is the pressure to commit fraud. So an example of that might be an employee who isn't able to pay their bills, they have kids that are in college, they have a mortgage payment, and they're just not making enough money. So they have a lot of pressure to commit fraud, and they have an opportunity to commit fraud. So the opportunity might be that there is a cash drawer that's always left open and nobody ever counts the cash. So there's an opportunity to commit fraud. And finally, there's the rationalization. So rationalization is basically thinking that it's okay. So maybe this employee thinks that they're not being paid very much. They think that nobody will care or know if I take money out of the cash drawer. That's rationalization. So for fraud to occur at the individual level, you'd need to have all of these three different components there. Now, when we talked about corporate governance, we talk about having different systems in place to promote the mission of the organization. And one of those missions is to encourage ethical behavior and prevent fraud and misstatements from occurring. So typically, what happens is that a company can have an internal control system, like for example, with the example that I gave of having an open cash box, putting a lock on the cash box. That's going to try to reduce this opportunity component. So all three different components have to exist for fraud to take place. Okay, so this fraud triangle is very important because it deals with individuals committing fraud. What about when organizations commit fraud? So let's take a look at an example of organizations committing fraud. This is Exhibit B. So in the 90s, Waste Management was misstating their financial information. So here in this chart, you can see that in 1992, Waste Management initially reported $850,036. These are in thousands. So $850,036,000, when their actual profit was less. It was $739,686. So this is a 15% overstatement. Okay, so the next year, they overstated their income by 57%, and then it was 25%, 78%, over 100%, and then 76%. Okay, so this is an example of an organization committing fraud over a period of time. Now, how is fraud typically uncovered when it's institutional fraud? Take a look at Exhibit B and look it down here. So we can think about before Sarbanes-Oxley and after Sarbanes-Oxley. Okay, so before Sarbanes-Oxley, how is fraud uncovered? 46.2% of the time it was uncovered because of a tip. Somebody tipping off the authorities. And internal control, you can see, was catching 23.3% of fraud before Sarbanes-Oxley. Now, of course, we live in a post-Sarbanes-Oxley world, right? So Sarbanes-Oxley has already been passed. How is fraud uncovered now? I would think with Sarbanes-Oxley, I would expect maybe more internal control being in play that would create a situation where fraud is uncovered, right? But actually, that's not the case. Even more so than before, fraud is uncovered by tips. Okay, so people that notify the authorities. Now, if you notify the authorities, if you're an employee within an organization, for example, and you notice fraud within the organization, if you notice institutional conflict of interest, institutional fraud, what does it mean when you go outside the company and you report that fraud? We call that whistleblowing. So let's take a look at the notes here. And I have a question for you. Is whistleblowing, or is blowing the whistle, a conflict of interest? We'll come back to this question in just a moment. But let's talk about what the law has to say about whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is covered under Section 806 of Sarbanes-Oxley. So typically for whistleblowing, the definition of whistleblowing is that you are either a current or past employee And the traditional legal definition of whistleblowing is that you go typically outside the organization. And so an example of whistleblowing might be if you work for Enron and you notice that Enron is fraudulently reporting their financial statements, and you decide to go outside the organization. For example, you contact the police or the IRS or the FBI, and you report the fraud that's going on within the organization. That's the traditional definition of whistleblowing. So, according to Sarbanes-Oxley, Section 806, whistleblowing means that the whistleblower must be either a current or past employee. So that means that if you're just an outside observer and you have no affiliation with a company, but you go ahead and report the company, that's actually not considered to be whistleblowing under Sarbanes-Oxley. And this is very interesting. Whistleblowing is delegated to the Department of Labor and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. The purpose of whistleblowing protection is to prevent retaliation and termination due to whistleblowing. So retaliation would mean, for example, that you are denied a promotion, or you're reassigned to a part of the company that is undesirable as punishment for you blowing the whistle on the organization. Or, of course, if you are terminated or fired because you blew the whistle. That would be termination as defined under the law. So Section 506 of Sarbanes-Oxley protects you against retaliation and termination. Now, let's take a look at the actual writing here, and I'll let you look at that, and I want to mention a couple things. So a couple of things I want to mention here. So if you are going to conform to this Section 806 of Sarbanes-Oxley, and you blow the whistle, in order to receive protection under the law, you have to establish here a prima facie case of retaliation. Prima facie means that on the surface, it looks like the company is retaliating against you because you blew the whistle. So, for example, if you are an employee and you blow the whistle, but you also happen to be a very bad employee, and you get demoted, well, you have to show that you're getting demoted not because you're actually a bad employee, but because you blew the whistle. So this means that the employee engaged in protected activity or conduct. In other words, you went to the authorities in good faith, and the employer actively or constructively knew that you went to the authorities on them. So not only do you have to show that you were retaliated against because you did something like report the company to the authorities, but the company actually knew or should have known that you went to the authorities and they punished you for doing so. So if we look at whistleblowing, why do people decide to blow the whistle? Well, the most commonly cited reason is because the company is doing something that's wrong or immoral. Another reason might be because it's causing unnecessary harm. So if you work for a chemical company and they're putting toxic chemicals in baby formula, that's obviously immoral, but it's also causing unnecessary harm. So a lot of these different components overlap with one another. Something could be a violation of human rights. So for example, if you are working for a company and they're using illegal slave labor, that's something that's a violation of human rights. If they're doing something that's illegal, right? So of course, just because something is illegal doesn't make it necessarily immoral. So these are two separate ideas. And another reason why employees might blow the whistle is because the organization is doing something that's contrary to the defined purpose of the organization or the institution. So, for example, I work for American University. So if I noticed that American University was doing something that is not in the best interest of the students, then I would say, well, that's something that's against their defined purpose. And that might be a reason for somebody to blow the whistle, for example. So the point is that people have a lot of different motivations for blowing the whistle. And sometimes the motivations tend to overlap. So as the example that we see here, causing unnecessary harm and something being immoral, those are two things that could be separate or things that overlap. Now, another aspect of blowing the whistle is why people blow the whistle. Do they do it for benign reasons, or do they do it for retributional reasons? Okay. So a benign reason would be what we tend to think of here in number 4. So I have nothing against this organization, but they are doing something that causes unnecessary harm. So I think this is wrong, it's illegal, it's immoral, it's against the defined purpose of the organization. I need to go outside the organization and I have to blow the whistle. That's what we consider to be benign examples of blowing the whistle. Another example of blowing the whistle is what we call retributional whistleblowing. Now, retributional whistleblowing tends to be more motivated because the employee is just simply unhappy with the organization. So retributional whistleblowing is when we have an employee that has an axe to grind. So maybe this employee thinks that the organization has done them wrong. They think this organization treats them unfairly. So they're angry, so they decide to go outside the organization and report something that's improper. Now, of course, they might still be reporting something that causes unnecessary harm and that's illegal, but their internal driving motivation is because they feel wronged and they want to, kind of have an outlet for that. So we can have benign types of whistleblowing or retributional types of whistleblowing. This is from the IRS's website. The IRS has a whistleblower informant award provision. So what this means is, and I'll read part of this for you, it says the IRS whistleblower office pays money to people who blow the whistle on persons who fail to pay the tax that they owe. If the IRS uses information provided by the whistleblower, it can award the whistleblower up to 30% of the additional tax penalty and other amounts it collects. So if you notice that somebody isn't paying their taxes or they're cheating on their taxes, then you can go and blow the whistle on them to the IRS and they'll give you a finder's fee. Okay, so this finder's fee can sometimes range in the millions of dollars. So my question to you is, if somebody is not paying their taxes, then which one of these 5 different things are they going against? Certainly, it's against the law not to pay taxes. You could argue that it's immoral. They should be paying taxes. And you could maybe make an argument for it causes unnecessary harm. Right? So if you don't pay your taxes, then that's going to cause harm to people because you could argue that the roads aren't going to be fixed because we pay taxes to fix roads. Okay, so you can see that these different factors have differing strengths. Now, if you go to the IRS and you blow the whistle on somebody, would you consider that to be benign whistleblowing or retributional whistleblowing? What do you think? I would say it probably depends. So if you have a neighbor that you don't like and you notice that they're not paying their taxes and you blow the whistle on them, maybe that's retributional. If you're the type of person that says, okay, well, this company is not paying their taxes, I have nothing against the company, but I need to report them, that could be more of the benign type of whistleblowing. But either way, the book mentions ethicist Norman Bowie, and Norman Bowie argues that whistleblowing is justified if and only if, and this is according to Norman Bowie, the whistleblower has a situation where they're operating from the appropriate moral motive. So according to Norman Bowie, he's an advocate for this benign whistleblowing method or approach. Whistleblowing is appropriate if the person has exhausted all internal channels for dissent before going public if possible. So you've tried to resolve the issue at the lowest level possible, but you simply can't. So you decide to go and escalate it to another level. Norman Bowie says whistleblowing makes sense if you have compelling evidence of wrongdoing. So you actually know firsthand that something is improper. You've carefully analyzed the dangers, including to yourself. And you have some chance of success. In other words, when you blow the whistle, something is going to happen for the positive. Okay, so with that being said, let's go back to this question here. Is whistleblowing a conflict of interest? Well, as a CPA, I would say whistleblowing is not a conflict of interest because as a CPA, if you have a primary duty to the public, then if you notice that your client is committing fraud and you report them, then you are maintaining this priority where you keep your primary interest first and your secondary interest second, and you don't try to subvert one for the other. So that concludes week 5. If you have any questions about this week's material, please let me know.